Hey everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the Mental Brew podcast. My name is Dennis Lorden, and today is a first. Today's the first time we've had two guests on simultaneously, which is fantastic. We've Dr. Raymond Kerr and we've got James Fitzgerald. Now, they're going to tell you what they do themselves or what they have done, and a lot more. They can make it a lot more interesting than I can. But two former FBI agents with some absolutely fantastic stories to tell, and some fantastic stories they've told themselves on their own podcast, which we'll get to as well at some stage in this little interview. But James and Ray, thanks so much for coming on.
You're welcome, Dennis. Nice to be on with your podcast, Fusion Performance.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Dennis. Glad to be here.
And I suppose I start off the podcast the same way, and you can answer this. You can similar, we say one at a time. But I suppose, why do you do what you do?
Ray, why don't you start?
Why did I do what I did? Let's put it that way, because
Okay.
both Jim and I are both retired. But why I did what I did was I always wanted to be a police officer ever since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
And a lot of my cousins and uncles were all cops. And I got the opportunity to join the FBI in the late 80s. And I took that opportunity, and I never regretted it once. It was probably the best time I had in my whole life, that almost 27 years.
Wow.
I really, really enjoyed it. I've met and worked with some of the brightest people in the world, some of the best investigators, some of the smartest people that I've ever been around. I was just amazed. And a lot of times I wondered, how did I get on this job? I mean, I'm not as smart as these guys, so there must have been something about me that they liked.
Yeah.
But I'm glad I got the opportunity.
Brilliant. You're up, James.
Yeah, as far as me, I didn't grow up wanting to get into law enforcement. I really had no one in my family in law enforcement or even the military. Just how it worked out with the time and the day. But I was at Penn State University and not sure what I wanted to do. And this new program called Law Enforcement and Corrections was available there. This is the early 1970s. Now it was one of the first colleges in the country to offer that kind of program. So I took it and I graduated with it, and I applied for a bunch of jobs, probation officer, parole officer. Times were tough in the mid 70s, applied for some police jobs. And back then you didn't need a college degree to be a police officer. In fact, my hometown is Philadelphia. And Ray, you may remember there were no educational requirements at all. I think through the 1980s, you could not even have graduated high school. And but I had a college degree, and I applied and wound up at a suburban Philadelphia police department called Ben Salem Township, about 100 sworn. Spent 11 years there, plainclothes, patrol officer, detective sergeant. Then the time was just ripe in the mid 80s to look around a little bit more. I was kind of too young to be a chief of police somewhere, but too old to start over as like a police rookie somewhere too. So the FBI was the logical place. And in November of 1987, I walked through the FBI Academy doors for a new agent training. And from there, 7 years in New York City. And then I was promoted to supervisor in 1995 to the profiling unit in Quantico, Virginia, back to the FBI Academy. My first case was Unabomb, and kind of moved on from there until retiring in 2007. And I can speak for Ray. I know we're both very busy in so-called retirement. And if you're listening, everyone, I have air quotes going. And we're both teaching. We're both writing books. We both do TV work. We both work cases still. So we're both very busy, and we on our own Cold Red podcast.
Yes.
Check us out there too. And we're true crime oriented. And I hope one of the very smart and intelligent and talented people Ray was referring to a few minutes ago, he included me in that batch. Ray?
Absolutely. Why would I not include you, Jim? Of all people, I'd have to include you. But I mean, it's just, Dennis, just as I was saying, I mean, you get a chance to work with people like Jim and other people.
And likewise.
And it's Jim and I met, believe it or not. Jim was on a bank robbery squad in New York, and I'm on a bank robbery squad in Philly. and
Yeah.
there's a call that comes down, and you hear a name and you talk to this guy and he says, "Hey, I got a lead down here that we believe a guy that robbed a bank is down in Philly." And I says, "All right, we'll take a look at it." And then a couple of years later, he winds up down in the profiling unit, and where a place I was aspiring to go, but I never got to. But I started doing it out in the field as a coordinator for the Philadelphia division. And we just have been friends since the early 90s. So our friendship goes back 30 years.
Wow.
And we'll be friends to the day we die. And then after, we always will be.
That's amazing. And
Assuming we wind up in the same place, Ray.
Well, Jim, well, here's the thing, Dennis, wherever he's at, I'll come and get him.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah. And I suppose when I kind of contacted James for the podcast, I obviously would have watched the Unabomber show on Netflix. I've actually watched it twice or three times. Brilliant. I know we obviously get into that kind of stuff as well, but really, really enjoyed it. And I kind of reached out, and obviously you were both kind enough to come on. And it was the first question that kind of came to me was, like, how does someone get in the FBI? So, like, is it can someone go in with no law enforcement experience? Is it they cherry pick the best from various departments across the country? How does it work?
Ray?
Well, anybody is eligible to come into the FBI, but there are minimum requirements that you have to meet.
Yeah.
And the first is you have to be at least 23 years of age.
Okay.
You have to have a college degree.
Yeah.
And you have to have 3 years of full-time work experience. Now, with that said, if you have those three things, your chances of getting in the FBI are probably slim and none. Because what they do look for is, you have to remember, in the FBI, there at any one time, there's 130,000 applications on file.
Wow.
And out of that 130,000, in 1 year, they may accept anywhere, if it's a good year, maybe 500. And a bad year, you're maybe 250, something like that.
Okay.
So your chances of getting in are really probably less than 1%. So you have to do something that sets you apart from everybody else.
Yeah.
So Jim Jim was a police officer, which, depending on the time when he applied, a lot of times when someone gets in, it's basically based on the needs of the Bureau or the FBI.
Yeah.
At that time, they probably needed police officers or people with backgrounds of police officers. Jim tested very well, and so forth and so on. Me, I went in, I had 4 degrees. I had 2 undergrad degrees and two master's degrees.
Wow.
So I separated myself a little bit from everybody else, which kind of made me more attractive. And that's kind of how you get in. But the thing is that the average age of agents that come into the Bureau, the average age, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, is probably about 29 or 30 years of age. Because the FBI is much more sophisticated than being a street cop.
Yeah.
You're handling some of the most complex investigations that are occurring, not just in the United States, but in the world. And you're not just dealing with cases that are in the United States. You're dealing with cases that are happening all over the world. That's why we also have offices in almost every country in the world. I don't know what the exact number is now, Jim. Do you have any idea what that is, Jim?
Over 50.
Yeah.
Maybe
Wow.
upwards
50
of 80
different
even.
countries. Mm-hmm.
And just to go ahead and go off topic and kind of focus on that little part, if there's 50 offices across the world, are those FBI agents then, like, is it known that they're FBI agents operating under that office, or is it something that have to be kind of kept covert? Or, I suppose, like, obviously in America, they flash the bag, everyone knows FBI, it's national law enforcement and whatnot. But abroad, is what way does that work?
Yeah, I'll answer that. When we both came in the FBI, there were only about maybe 10 or 12 legal attaches,
Right.
legats for short. And these are agents in just the largest cities in the world: London, Canberra, Australia, usually the capitals of the countries. I know Paris and a few other European countries, few South American. under Director Louis Freeh in the starting in the early 1990s, he greatly expanded the legal attaché program. And the agents there, they have no arrest powers because they're obviously in another jurisdiction. So we'll take the agent in London. So he'd be the legat, and he has some assistant legats working with him.
Yeah.
And London is a very prized office. If you don't get there when you first enter the legat program. You may go to a country with 7 syllables in it that with no vowels, and that's where you start. I'm not knocking those countries, but I'm just saying you don't always go to the ones. You may, if you know the language, that helps. But you can certainly work with translators. So the larger legats, like London, may have 6 to 8 FBI agents there working out like a State Department office. They're not undercover. They don't go out and make arrests, but they work with New Scotland Yard and other police agencies throughout the UK, certainly throughout Ireland. I'm not sure if there's a legat Dublin or not. I'm sure the agent from London would cover that. So yeah, they're all over the world, and you can put in for that program and kind of raise your hand. And again, you may not start out at Paris or London, but if you go a few stops in between or beforehand, you could wind up in some of the bigger offices. And they're nice details. You may spend 2 years there. They'll help set up training. So they used to bring us profilers over to different countries. I know Ray's traveled under the kind of the auspices of legats in other countries, and they'll set up training. So that's how they give something back to the host country. So it's sort of a quid pro quo, all above board, legitimate. Now the CIA, our sister agency, they're the ones that do the covert stuff and undercover and, ABC, imports, things like that. I'm only kidding. It's not a real company with the CIA, but they're the ones that do that thing. So we're busy all around. And to go back to your original question, when Ray and I came in, I think there were only 5 categories. It was computer background, language, accounting, lawyer, and general. And Ray, I think you and I basically came in under general.
Yeah, believe it or not, I had the accounting degree and I came in under diversified. And then once I got in, they came back to me and they said, would you want to take the accounting exam to come in under the accounting program? And what I had heard from agents I spoke to is once you come in under the accounting program, you're kind of earmarked into working white collar crime cases. And I was really interested in bank robberies and fugitives and kicking down doors. I was interested in the stuff you see on TV, right? So that's what I'm looking at. And so I didn't want to get pigeonholed to going through documents and things of that nature. So I declined to do that. I said, is it going to affect my status if I say no? And they said, no, it will not. So I decided not to take the accounting exam. And I haven't used accounting other than a few things in doing my taxes over here. Other than that, I don't use it at all, believe it or not.
And for clarification's sake, you're right. I think it was diversified section. I had a different meaning back in the 80s than it does now.
It does. Yeah, exactly.
And they've expanded it. Now there is a separate, there's like 7 or 8 categories where agents are sort of, I won't say pigeonhole, but they're brought in and they test just among themselves. Law enforcement is one, military is one, languages is one, computer science, I think forensics is another. Then there's always like a standard or general.
Jim, I think there's even a healthcare because of the
right.
You get dentists, doctors. I mean, I had a dentist that was in my class. I mean, he was an actual dentist. I had him look at a tooth. I was in the academy. I had a toothache. He looked he couldn't do anything. He said, if I had you in my office, I could help you. But he goes, I can't do anything here. But so we have all. I mean, the people that just come through, are just amazing. I mean, the smartest and the brightest of the crop.
That is mad.
And Dennis, the last part of that is you do have to also be a U.S. citizen, but you can be a naturalized U.S. citizen. So as long as you become, raise your hand at some point, go through all the testing and all that background stuff, which doesn't happen too much in this country anymore with the southern border, but that's another story. But if you are legit a naturalized citizen, Ray and I work with a number of them over the years. I'm not sure any Irishmen or not. Ray, have I come across, but that are then naturalized U.S. citizens, but definitely from other European and South American countries.
I did work one case temporarily. I had a couple contacts with the Garda on a fugitive matter.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, man, that's mad. You wouldn't like obviously, my knowledge of the FBI is limited. Like, is it kind of it's all TV shows and everything else, but the see the worldwide reach of it is mad. And I'm gonna James, I have a question for yourself, and Ray, I'll follow up the same question with
Mhm.
yourself once James is done. But can I suppose with yourself, right? Is there any kind of cases you've worked that were really challenging or really difficult that kind of come to mind from your career?
Um, sure. Definitely, a handful or two that I still think about, I still wonder about, in terms of, could we ever identify, either where is a missing person or, or who actually committed a crime. A lot of people know me for Unabomb, and that was the most challenging case I ever worked. It was my first case as a profiler, and
Yeah.
I was shipped out to San Francisco. Had never been there before, and I was assigned to the task force. And even though we were all FBI, they were feeling me out. I was feeling them out, and we luckily did hit it off, personally, professionally, and all that. And all of a sudden, I kind of became the document guy, and that wasn't my background. I too had a master's in psychology. I still do, obviously, but even back then, before I even got my linguistics master's, and but looking and assessing documents wasn't my thing. So that case was 17 years old when they brought me onto it, and
Mm.
I said, "What can I do?" I was a seasoned investigator, but I was a rookie profiler, and while I did use my training of 12 weeks of a mini academy we profilers had before we graduated, so to speak. It was still pretty new to me, and I was consulting with the profilers back in Quantico, but then all of a sudden the documents became the key. My first week out there, the manifesto is received by the New York Times and the FBI. So that case is that. And on a personal level, I was in the FBI, finished working Unabomb, worked a lot of cases, later DC Sniper, helped solve that case in 2002. The anthrax case, did some work on that and helped put it together, a few years later.
Mm.
But, and Ray knows about this case. I have a good friend who was murdered in a street robbery in Philadelphia, and
Wow.
that case remains unsolved to this day. That was 1998. And there wasn't much behavior involved. It wasn't a sex crime. It was give me your money. My friend kind of resisted. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all my profiling skills, all my investigative skills, to this day, um, to the best of me utilizing them, just that case still remains unsolved. His name is Joe Welsh. It's been over 25 years now, and in my fourth and final book in my memoir series, I cover that case. And for one of the first times, I'll say here, I'm offering a personal reward for anyone who comes forward and gives us information on that. A little premature for our talk now, Dennis, but I'll let you know more about it when that time comes.
So yeah,
So
definitely.
2 cases, one solved, which I had no real personal connection to, meaning Unabomb,
Yeah.
and a bunch of other cases out there I was directly involved in. And then this one case, which I tried to help the Philadelphia PD. It's their case. And to this day, it's unsolved. So that is my most frustrating case.
Yeah. Sorry to hear that, especially with a friend involved. And what about yourself, Ray?
Well, I've had quite a few cases, a little bit different than Jim's.
Mm.
One that is most memorable to me is the one that I wrote a book on, 30 Years on the Run.
Yeah.
It was about a bank robber that at the time when we're doing the investigation, we were under the impression that he had only robbed banks for 13 years. And then
Only 13 years, right? Right.
only 13 years, when you say only, you think, oh, only 13 years. But, an average bank robber, if you look at bank robbery, if you're any good, you last about 2 weeks, for the average bank robber. And
Okay.
here's a guy that's lasted 13 years. But then when I sat down to first interview him before Jim came in to help me with some of the interviews, I said, when was your first bank robbery? And he told me 1974, which was, 29 years prior to his arrest. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that was kind of my first oh shit moment with this thing when I said, holy shit, I'm not ready to talk to this guy about that. So we went back and I said, let's start back with your childhood and so forth and so on. And we went through that. And I brought Jimmy in with me to kind of look at him from a behavioral standpoint and getting another opinion. And Jim and I were friends, and Jim and I sat down and we spent, I think, 2 or 3 days with him, going through his whole background, his history of why he did what he did. And here's a guy that, by all means, he could have been more successful than Jim and I. He was an engineer with a degree from Villanova. He went into the military during the Vietnam era, came out, goes to the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League school, and gets a master's degree in systems engineering, and then decides to go to Penn State, Jim's alma mater, and start working on his PhD in statistics. But he never quite finished that. But that whole time, I sat and we talked, and I said, had you gone the straight and narrow, you probably could have made more money than you did in the 50 plus banks that you robbed over that 30-year period. So, and the great thing about this guy is that he had bunkers that were strategically located throughout the eastern part of the United States. So you look at Ireland, and Ireland is about the size of West Virginia. Well, he didn't have any bunkers in West Virginia, but he had bunkers in Pennsylvania and all the way out to the western part of Pennsylvania and New York. And you could probably put 2 or 3 islands inside of New York, or 2 or 3 islands inside the state of Pennsylvania. And you look here, he had them in Connecticut. He had them south in Delaware. He had them all over the place. So it was amazing. He was amazing in what he was doing. But the thing is that he was able to get away with this for such a long period of time.
And how did you catch him?
Well, believe it or not, it wasn't as though we caught him. We got lucky. There were 2 kids, and it's you always say, I'd rather be lucky than good, and you got to give credit where credit is due. 2 kids were playing in the woods, and they discovered the first bank robbery, or the first bunker, which was located next to a little league field and about 1/8 of a mile from a police station. And it was in the woods, and the bunker backed up to a berm, and on the top of that berm was an old railroad track where a trolley used to run between Center City, Philadelphia, and out to the suburbs, because this was in Radnor, Pennsylvania. And on the other side of that berm are $1 million homes. So this is the type of area that he was putting a bunker in. And the bunker was about 3 foot deep and about probably about 2 feet or 2.5 feet in diameter. And there were ammo cans in there. There were plastic buckets on all these different things. Had documents. We recovered 5 weapons, several hundred rounds of ammunition, and all because these kids were playing. They didn't find that bunker. They found something else that led the police to find it. And that's when they called me. And at the time, we didn't know what we were looking at. But once I went through the documents, I knew that the guy that had been robbing banks, at least we knew since 1987, was buried in this bunker here. I didn't know his name at that point. And then that's when the investigation started with that, and trying to put some things together with it. So that was a great case. And then, I did some other things. I ran a gang investigation where a gang in a city outside of Philadelphia was heavily into the drug action, but it wasn't the drugs that were really the issue. The issue was the violence inside of the gang. And the violence led to the killing of a federal witness and the killing of a police officer, which prompted our involvement in the case. So.
Brilliant. That's mad. That's mad. And just regarding, we say, the job, right? So I work with athletes and and businesses, and the big thing I'd focus on is pressure and how to deal with pressure. How, especially in your careers to date, you've a massive case, even with Unabomb, really people lost their lives, people want to find answers, authorities want to find answers. Like, how do you deal with that pressure of trying to, stop the next crime or next bank robber, or arrest them, and get them off the streets essentially. How do you deal with that pressure? And what does that do for you in terms of performance?
Well, yeah, I'll start here, and I think Ray's answer will sort of follow along with what I'm saying. Is that and I've played amateur sports. Ray was a college football player, but I mean, there's pressure on the field. Even
Yeah,
like the big intramural game, but it doesn't match to the pressure of number one, knowing there's a serial offender out there
absolutely.
killing people or raping people.
Yeah,
And the pressure even is compounded when you're going to arrest that person and you know they have weapons or you suspect they may have weapons and you're outside the door. You may have your ballistic vest on, you have your AR-15s, your tactical weaponry and helmets, SWAT team, all those things. And I'll tell you, when you actually kick the door in, instincts and training take over. But I always found while I was waiting for that moment, okay, you're going through the ABCs, the 1, 2, 3. What if this happened? That happens. Is this person assigned to the right place? Is that person assigned? Do I 100% trust the person next to me, the fellow agent? And we just had 4 law enforcement officers killed a few days ago in Charlotte, North Carolina, serving an arrest warrant on in like mid afternoon, and that's how tragic and these things can happen. I've lost law enforcement friends. I know Ray has, and so there's no pressure more than that. I
yeah,
also I'm also familiar with some agents who have worked undercover operations, with some bad people, and we've interviewed a few of them, Ray, on Cold
Yep.
Red, including Donnie Brasco himself, Joe Pistone,
Mhm.
and check that episode out of Cold Red, everyone, if you want to hear a really interesting story. And he came so close to buying it a few times, but he managed to talk his way out of it or fist fight his way out of it in one case, and he lived to actually turn all the evidence in and get a bunch of people arrested. So the pressure comes in different ways, and you do have to learn early on. I was lucky as a police officer to learn that you have to kind of put a wall in your brain. It's a figurative one, of course,
yeah,
that when you get home, when it's with the family, with the kids, you got to leave that stuff behind. You got to leave that somewhere in the back of your brain. It does filter in every once in a while, but I would never tell my kids the gory stories or this stabbing victim or rape victim. I'd come home and tell them like funny stories that all law enforcement people can talk about. But uh, and I'll leave it with this, and I'll want to hear what Ray has to say. But not every law enforcement officer or agent handles it exactly the same way.
yeah,
I know people who work kiddie crimes, child pornography and pedophiles, things like that. They're only assigned 2, maybe 3 years at most, because that job can be so trying.
yeah,
Then administratively, they're pulled out. Someone else will come in and take their job. So there's issues like that happen too, and that can affect someone's mindset. So it's not easy, but I think what's important as a police sergeant, I used to tell my guys at roll call and women that you know law enforcement can't be your whole life. When the shift ends, go out and do something else. Don't only have cops and agents as your friends. Have people in the real world, and that helps you. People from like high school and your old neighborhood, that can really keep you balanced too. And that's kind of how I worked it out in my life, and I never had any serious problems in that regard. Some cases bother me at the time, some
yeah.
do now, but in the whole, I left that to one part of the brain and I left my personal life, you know, for the other part.
On my end, Dennis, I don't know if I'd call it stress. I
Yeah.
don't call it stress. I call it indifference,
Okay.
at least for me. Um, I did the best I could, and I know Jim did too, to compartmentalize
Yeah.
and keep things separate. It was important for me to keep it separate for my wife, for my children. So when I would come home, I was dad. I was not the FBI agent on the street, and I would get calls. And my son one time commented to me, he was like 15 years old, I think, and he says, "It's amazing how you can turn it on and turn it off, Dad." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "The phone rings. I'm on the phone and I'm talking to a guy in the hood, a bad guy or one
Yeah.
of my informants. And I'm going, yo, bud, what's up? What's going on in the hood? What's up the way? I'm
Yeah.
talking like they talk in the street.
Yeah.
I know that's a lot of slang for people that might be listening to what you have there with your listeners, but I was using that slang that people talk in the street. And then I get off the phone and I start talking to my son about his schoolwork. And he
Yeah.
goes, I'm just amazed that you can just turn it on and turn it off. And you just become very, very good. But the thing that people don't realize is that what Jim and I have seen over our careers is we've seen the worst of the worst of what one human being will do to another.
Yeah.
And it's funny, but when you look at mammals, we're supposed to be the smartest mammal that God put on this earth.
Yeah.
But yet we're the only mammal that kills its own. No other mammal does that.
Mm.
And I don't understand how can we be that intelligent, but yet we don't get the simple premise of how valuable life is. And that's what Jim and I do on our podcast. We look and we don't so much focus on the offender. Yeah, we do, but we try to shed the focus and shed the light on the different types of victims and how important those victims are. And I know you work with athletes. I work with athletes. In Buffalo, when I was in Buffalo, I did 1 year in Buffalo and 1 year in Philly, where I actually went in and spoke in their camp, in their training camps, um, about the pitfalls of gambling and the pitfalls of some of the things getting in trouble and getting with the wrong different types of people. And I did that in Philadelphia one time with Harold Carmichael. He asked me to come in because he was a neighbor where my mother lived over in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. But the one guy that really got me involved in that was Andre Reed. And Andre Reed is a Hall of Fame football player with the Buffalo Bills when their Super Bowl runs with Jim Kelly.
Wow.
And Reed and I, although we were not teammates in college, we went to the same college, and he was a little younger than me. So when I left, that's when he came in. But we got a chance to reconnect up in Buffalo, and he's a good man. He had a fantastic career. But when you look at stress, see when you get in some, and I looked at some of the things. Another case was an international auto theft ring that we looked at, Dennis, and the international auto theft ring involved a lot of the Eagles. They were actually, believe it or not,
Philadelphia Eagle professional
Philadelphia,
football team.
Philadelphia. Yes, thank you, Jim, for clarifying that. But what they were doing, unbeknownst to them, they were not. Are they culpable to a point? They are. But what was happening is they were purchasing cars, $60,000, $70,000 cars for $20,000. These cars were stolen and they were replated. But
Yeah.
they think these Eagles players, we're not going to mention their names, they thought, and this is going back into the 90s, so it's almost 30 years ago, they thought that, oh, just like everybody else gives me free meals and a free rental car and free this and free that, I'm getting a great deal in this because of what I do and who I am.
Yeah.
And that was the pitfalls. We always said, hey, look, not everything is as it seems.
Yeah.
Really, really be aware, especially when people are giving you something. Dennis, nothing in this life is for free. So you got to be careful.
Absolutely. And obviously, so you both said, look, we're able to set a boundary around bringing work home because the family life and stuff is important. But even with that, does can a case become obsessive? Like, can it become an obsession where, like, it's like pulling a thread? You know what I mean? You get a little bit maybe of evidence or a lead, and it leads to something else, and leads to something else. Does that happen, or is that boundary still there where you're home and you're home?
Well, I'll just and there are times in certain cases when you don't go home. So
Yeah.
the kids won't be infected with what you may be living at that time.
Yeah.
And in my New York days, I would, be away 3 days at a time, sometimes working a kidnapping of some sort. Usually they were drug related or they were kind of human bondage type things. People brought from one country and they have to work in servitude in some kitchen somewhere. Then they leave and so they kidnap a family member. But you'd still spend 3 days, sleeping in a car, putting the seat back when you get a chance. There were, shootings of fellow agents and detectives we work with, and you'd spend 2 or 3 days putting those cases together. It's not tough. I should say it's very tough when you have to stay awake for multiple days and still have your senses about you. And also, not too many jobs require you keep your senses about you, but there may be a bad guy. You go to his door, you don't know that's the bad guy's door. He comes at you with a gun, so your reflexes better be ready to go, and you better have your pistol or your long rifle, whatever, ready to go, and your senses and your instincts better carry in no matter how tired you are. So, yeah, I suppose the closest to me was Unabomb, because for the first time in my life, in an investigation, I had so much written material from a killer.
Yeah.
And we're talking about Ted Kaczynski, of course, but we didn't know his name at the time. And I just would go over this stuff, and it's such a benefit to any investigation to have known writings from your killer.
Yeah.
And I mean, with social media nowadays, you get a little bit more. Sometimes it's after the fact, but sometimes there may be some killer with a pseudonym or just completely anonymous that's putting stuff out there. But in the mid 90s, no one was as prolific a writer as the Unabomber, certainly by the time the manifesto came out. And I would sit with that day after day, turning pages. And I'd find myself getting tired 3 or 4 hours in, take a break, come back, and start over again. Then the next morning, I would start at the halfway point and just trying to pick up puzzle pieces. I was convinced this guy was bright enough to have left, crumbs for the investigator, some accidentally, some purposeful, that we could then put this puzzle piece together in an attempt to identify just who he was. And of course, there's a whole argument: do we have the New York Times publish the manifesto or not? It turned out to be the Washington Post which published it, but that was a big argument back in the day. Are we acceding to the demands of a terrorist? I was in the middle of those discussions. I was one of the first people to say, you know what, there's enough distinctive language in here. Someone's going to recognize it somewhere. A former teacher, a professor, maybe a family member. So I'm not sure obsessed is the right word, because if you're truly obsessed, you've kind of lost your touch with reality.
Okay.
But I would say very focused, maybe even laser focused at times, because this guy could kill again. He could mail a bomb anytime to anyone, and including one of us, an FBI agent. So I don't think a case ever had me, by definition, obsessed, but certainly laser focused over days and sometimes even weeks. But every brain needs a little bit of a break in there. And you need to take a day off or a half a day or something, but then come back to it. And I'm sure I'm seeing Ray nod. I know there's a few cases he's had that way too.
Dennis, I'll tell you, it's what Jim says. There's a ring of truth to it. And I agree with Jim. I don't think it's obsessed with it, but I think something you can't forget. And I go back, and every time someone asks me this question, I go back to a 1992 case where a 12-year-old boy, Mark Heimbach, and you might remember this case, Jim. He was from Drexel Hill, PA, disappeared down at the Jersey Shore, down in Cape May, New Jersey. And I happened to be involved in that. That young boy has never, ever been recovered. His body, they've never charged anybody in it. So that's 32 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's not, every time someone says that, that's the first thing that pops to my mind. And I think about that young boy often.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is there something? And then Jim says, like when he lost his friend, Mr. Walsh, and I look and I go, everything I know, and there's nothing I can do. And all the police officers that worked that case, nothing that we could do to kind of bring closure. And we tried, and they continue to try. It's not as though it goes away, but I continue. That's a case that haunts me, and I think it'll haunt me to the day I die, because I'd love to bring closure, not just for the young boy, but for that. And Jim and I, although we weren't personally involved, extrinsically we were involved in the Boy in the Box case, Jim, with the Vidoc Society, where a kid was found in, what was it, 1960?
No, 57. 57. It was in
Found
the
in 57? 57. And they just identified him in 2023. And Jim and I went to the celebratory. So 60 years later, he is identified through genealogy. So there's something, and the Vidoc Society that took that up as their own personal crutch, and they carried the torch for that young boy and the cops, retired officers and present officers, never ever gave up. Never ever gave up, and they're really role models for every police officer out there, that you never give up on a case. And that's kind of our mindset. So when Jim and I are working a case, and Jim and I get transferred to another office, or we decide to retire, guess what? The case doesn't go cold. The case doesn't shut down. There's someone else that's going to take our spot.
Yeah.
And there's someone else that's going to stand up and continue the trek to try and bring justice to that family and to that person, whoever it may be.
And just, I suppose this a question about, I suppose, what is the biggest, I wouldn't say threat now to the FBI, but say, I suppose, what's the biggest thing that's kind of maybe going on in the world today? Like, so like what I have in my head is kind of child trafficking, the movie Sound of Freedom. Like, is that prevalent? Like, it's starting to kind of reach kind of mainstream media in terms of maybe what could be going on, or, but I watched that film in the cinema, and I watched it recently here on TV again, and the start of it was chilling. Like, because I'm a new father of a 5-month-old son, and like the start of that was absolutely chilling. Like, how big of an issue is that, or would you know, or have you touched on it, or?
Yeah, human trafficking is a major issue in every country in the world, and certainly includes young children too. And I saw the same movie. It was very well done. Of course, parts of it were fictionalized, just like Manhunt Unabomber. And I know Ray's working on something right now that Hollywood has to kind of compress characters and or time and composite characters. But on the whole, that movie told a very good story about real problems out there. It is certainly that is one of the major problems. Of course, in the U.S., there's the fentanyl problem. We know it's coming over the southern border. We know there's bad actors, other countries that are behind that. I mean, it's there's mostly young men dying. Multiple die every day based on that, and a lot of it's coming through our southern border. And I think what we're seeing in the world now is just a lot of a loss of respect, and I think a lot of leaders aren't what they could be and can be. I know Ireland has some problems, and by the way, both Ray and I have Irish roots. Fitzgerald and Carr. Ray was just there about a month ago. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit, Ray. And I'm going back in the next year to Ireland. I was there in 1978, visit Donegal and Cork, all the way down the west coast. I have certainly family there. Goes back a few generations, but I know Ireland has some problems in that regard, and I think we're having kind of a culture clash in many of these countries that it seems good on paper and it seems good to talk about, but I think in reality it's presenting some problems against women, against the vulnerable of whatever nationality or ethnicity who may just be caught in the middle of it, and I really think our world needs to kind of just start realizing the vulnerable among us have to be better protected. Protect the kids and give them the proper educations and upbringings, and that can solve a lot of the problems certainly in the future. But there's some bad actors out there nationwide, countrywide, other countries, and we're seeing what's happening on American universities right now. A lot of people don't understand where these students are getting their mindsets from and who they're protesting against and who they're protesting or aligning with. And it's just a confusing time, and you wonder, where are their parents? What did their professors teach them over these years? And it's getting ugly in many ways, and we see a lack of respect for law enforcement. I think that's a big factor too. Again, 4 officers killed. I think 2 U.S. Marshals and 2 police officers working together just this week alone, and it happens all the time. A uniformed police officer in Chicago was coming home from his shift about 2 weeks ago, and 3 or 4 carjackers jump out, drag him out of his car, shoot him. He's in uniform, shoot him 18 times just to steal his car.
Jesus.
And it's like 3 a.m, and it's just a problem with a lot of people that just don't seem to have their priorities in the right place. And we can spend a whole other podcast talking about this, but Ray is right. In our Cold Red podcast, we'll talk to law enforcement people, we'll talk to victims, and the victims and their family are the ones we really focus on. And again, it comes down to the children. protect them and give them the right upbringing, and the future will be a much better place. But again, easier said than done. And I'll leave it with quoting from Pink Floyd, "Hey teacher, leave the kids alone." And you can take that in many different ways.
Absolutely,
Nowadays.
100%. It's something we're starting to see over here now, even in terms of is what way they want to educate them about this and about that. But it's obviously become a lot more real for me. When you have a little baby here, he's upstairs now with his mom asleep. But we were talking about this in work today, actually. Just we like in Ireland, I'd be worried about Ireland in the next 5 or 10 years, the way it's going. But as you said, that's probably a different conversation for a different day. But Ray, what would you say, just kind of touching on kind of what James said, would you have anything to add to that, or is it kind of similar?
Well, it's similar but different, but I echo his sentiments.
Yeah,
He said, when Jim talked earlier about being away for 3 days and working kidnapping cases. Those kidnapping cases, if you put the same circumstances and brought them into today's here and now, they would be human trafficking cases.
okay.
They really were. When you look at human trafficking, it's a multi-billion-dollar a year business. The money that's being made with illegal immigrants, and even U.S. citizens. And what I was shocked at, Dennis, is that when I was in Ireland, besides the stone walls, I mean, wherever you go, there's a stone wall in Ireland,
Yeah,
at least down in the southern part.
yeah,
In front of every house, there's a stone
yeah,
wall. I love it. I love it. But I noticed the amount of immigrants. Now, my family, on my mother's side, the Halligans, were from Claremorris,
yeah.
and they own a couple farms in Claremorris. And we didn't get over to see them because we wanted to see some other parts of my wife's first time over. But they used to have a pub they owned in a hotel called called Alligans in Claremorris in County Mayo. But when we were going, what I noticed is the amount of immigrants that are in Ireland.
Yeah,
And when I was talking to some of the individuals, they said, we're being overrun. He said,
yeah,
they're just coming in. He goes, but we need them because of tourism and they're working. And most of the people that we ran into in some of the restaurants and the pubs were immigrants, unless you get into the small towns. And then, you have the good old Irish that are in the small towns that still kind of do their thing. But when you get into the cities in Galway, in Dublin, by the way, I saw Fitz's name on one of the bars there. I can never get away from that guy. I saw Fitzgerald's, I can never get away from him. But
yeah,
when you look at human trafficking and you talk about the sound of freedom, you think, oh, it's just putting these kids in and doing servitude and prostitution. You look at stripping, you look at pornography. Pornography is a billion-dollar industry. These live sex shows, sex tourism, brothels, massage parlors,
yeah,
and then you get into some of the domestic servitude. Look at housekeeping. Look at child rearing, servile marriage, where they're coming over here, false adoptions. All these things are taking place as they relate to human trafficking. So it's kind of amazing when you look at what's going on and you sit and you say, well, what kind of companies are doing this? Well, they're using elder care because they're using where they take care of older people, criminal acts, shoplifting, all that stuff. Look at all of the immigrants that are coming in here into the United States. They can't afford anything. They cannot afford a thing. So what are they supposed to do? You go into a nail salon, and my wife says she's in a nail salon over here in the States, and nobody speaks English. Everybody is from either Thailand, China, Vietnam, something of that nature. So you really have a lot of things going on. And you look at this and you say, because a lot of times in order to get into this country, a lot of the cartels and people that are getting them in at the southern border and even on the northern border, there's a fee for that.
yeah.
There's a fee. And if they don't pay it, then their family at home suffers or something of that nature. So it's a real problem, real problem.
Well, yeah, it definitely, and it's like what you said about Ireland. Ireland is bang on as well. And I suppose the lightning of the second. Have you both been to Cork? James, you mentioned you'd family originally from Cork, did you?
Um, I was there in 78 in a whole different life. And it was a wonderful trip. I think we were in the outskirts of Cork, but I didn't really know my roots as much, my nationalistic roots, if so to speak, as much back then. We spent a week in Donegal, then came down through Galway and Lisdoon Varna, and I can still remember Sligo. And just very beautiful. But 3.5 years ago, I bought my three sons and me Aer Lingus tickets,
Yeah.
and we were all ready to go in March of 2020. We had it booked. We had Airbnb and hotels lined up, and I know you know what happened then with COVID, and we had to cancel everything. Luckily, Aer Lingus gave us like a 5-year window to use those tickets again. So we are planning my three sons, the four Fitzgerald men, heading back there in the next year. And I do want to spend some time in Cork and maybe even look up. But I think it was my great grandfather that came over here right during the famine, and so my connection is pretty far back, not as recent as some other people I know.
Brilliant. So, that's brilliant. And Ray, where were you?
Well, we started out in Dublin, and from Dublin we went to Donegal. We were going to go to Tyrone because my father's side is from Tyrone.
Yeah.
But we didn't go any further north in Donegal. We came down to Galloway. We went to Killarney. We went to Cork. We went to Gap of Wicklow, and then worked our way back up the East Coast. So we kind of went all over. I went to Cong, saw where they filmed The Quiet Man with Maureen O'Hara and John Wayne, the bike and stuff like that. That good. And I said, have you ever seen the movie?
Which one was that?
The Quiet Man.
I've seen bits of it. I'll be honest.
Wow.
It would have been a while ago.
I tell you, it's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Me too.
In the movie, John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara take off on a bike for two.
Yeah.
And Michelin is chasing them.
My uncle, Barry Fitzgerald, by the way.
Barry Fitzgerald. And the horse and buggy just stops automatically. And he falls back in the carriage and he looks up, and they're right out in front of the bar, Pat Cohan. Right. And he looks at it and he said, so I get on when I'm in Cong, I get on the phone with my mother and I says, Mom, I said, my car broke down. I'm in Cong, Ireland. She goes, oh my God, what happened? And she's 91 years old. So right away she worries. I said, it stopped right in front of this bar, Cohan's. And I said, I don't know what happened. And she started laughing because she knew exactly what I was saying.
Yeah.
But it didn't break down. I was just teasing her.
That's very good. James, can I ask you a couple of questions about Unabomber?
Sure.
So we obviously talked about kind of the pressure side of it. Just started off, what did you make of the manifesto when you were reading it?
Yeah, it was, I read it for the first time on a flight from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. And I had a big 3-ring binder. We didn't have tablets or laptops back then. At least I didn't, or the FBI didn't. So big 3-ring binder. I was sent out to the Unabomber task force, which just started about a year prior, and I was the new profiler. So I'm reading it, and boy, this guy is dense. It reads like an old dissertation of some sorts. I always remember the paragraphs were numbered, pages were numbered, and the paragraphs were numbered, which is kind of unusual. But we did some research down the line, and that's how 1950s and 1960s dissertations were written. So that helped us age this person a bit. But what I found interesting, and I was kind of ashamed to admit it back then, but I confided in a few people, is that this Unabomber guy, again, I did not support him killing people, bombing people, ripping them to shreds, almost bringing an airliner down with over 200 people on it. But about every third or fourth page, I'd be saying to myself, geez, this guy's kind of right about this.
Yeah.
And, he references, or at least intimates, artificial intelligence, a few times, and how it could get carried away and take over our society, and how electronic communications are not bringing us closer together, but taking us farther apart.
Yeah.
And well, that's a little bit wacky there, but some things I picked up right away, and some things it was a few years later.
Yeah.
And he had this, problem with leftism. He didn't call them liberals; he called them leftists, and he didn't like big business, big government. And of course, his overall solution in his manifesto was that we should break up capitalism and everything we're living under right now, and we should all go back to living in tribes in an agrarian society, living off the land and
Yeah.
hunting and fishing, growing crops, and in tribes of no more than 30 people. So that kind of helped us, figure this guy is a loner. He's not from a big family or has a big family. He probably doesn't, associate with lots of people. And that again is helping us narrow the suspect pool by putting together this profile. Nobody thought he was living in a cabin by himself in the middle of Montana. I didn't, and others. But the more we were getting reading his writings, that really came together there. So I wrote a letter to him back in 2016 because the producers of Manhunt Unabomber they thought it'd be a great ending to the series if in real life, the real Fitz, that's me, actually went into prison, the Supermax in Florence, Colorado, where Kaczynski was, and had a sit-down interview with him.
Yeah.
I tried once before when I was still in the FBI. It didn't work out. It's all in my book. And actually, this chapter's in my book too, but I wrote him a letter and I knew not to type it or use a word processor or a computer. So I actually wrote on like 4 yellow legal pages, hand wrote my letter to him because he's anti-technology. And I thought I would be offending him by sending something off of a computer or out of a printer. So, but it's weird if you ever sit down nowadays and write out a long letter by hand. It's kind of weird because you can't cut and paste. You can't back space, whatever. So I actually wound up typing the whole thing out. And then I had the screen in front of me. I guess I even printed it. Then I just copied onto a yellow legal pad and did it that way. He never responded to my letter to interview him. So I never did. And of course, he died back in June. Ray and I did a special episode of Cold Red that day, and it was dropped like within 24 hours. And that's still out there on our coldredpodcast.com website.
I listened to it. It's very good.
And just a lot of thoughts and ideas. And we didn't even know then that Kaczynski committed suicide. So, which they're saying now it is. A lot of people forget too, when he was awaiting trial, he tried to commit suicide and he failed. And whether it was legit or not, we don't know, but something in the jail cell, he tried to hook something up and kill himself, but that didn't work. And, no one likes to see suicide as an answer, even for the worst people. His hell was living by himself in a cell, which actually, come to think of it, he was living by himself in a cabin, but he was not in the middle of nature anymore. He couldn't go out and hunt and fish. So that he paid a high price for what he did. So not sure if I exactly answered your question, but
perfect,
just his letters to other people and other victims, as well as the manifesto, taught me a lot about this person. And that really, if you have a diary or you have social media, it really is, they say the eyes are the window to the soul. But if someone's willing to put out, reams of paper or multiple screens of digitized, eyes and, ones and zeros, you can really learn a lot about them. And Ray and I have been on our Cold Red podcast. There's a few mass killers out there that the law enforcement has their manifestos, but they refuse to release them. So happens the Nashville shooter is one of them, who happened to be a trans person. And someone about 6 months ago snuck out a few words. And I said, no, get these manifestos out there. We, the public, have to know what these people are thinking, how their brain computes, and how the the synapses connect. And but so far that hasn't been released. It seems that they're from sort of if the killers are from one ideology or philosophy, the media and law enforcement have no problem putting it out. But if they're from another, it's almost like they're protected people. And they don't get released. But that's not fair to the rest of us, who are the ones potentially being shot up. So
we're seeing the same here, actually. If there's an attack and it's Irish, it's always said it's Irish, but if it's someone outside of Irish, it's never named, just a male assailant or whatever.
Strange how that works, huh?
Yeah. And just a question for both of you, right? We say along the lines of building a profile. So it was just James first. You obviously use language to help catch the Unabomber, right? the manifesto, you got other letters and stuff from them to kind of build up the profile of language use, right? But does something like AI now, right, make it harder for you to do your job? Because I can write a manifesto on ChatGPT without giving away my style or I wouldn't say mannerisms now through text, but like whatever tendencies I use during that, would say, passage I'm writing. Does that make your job harder, or is it nearly impossible then to kind of catch someone in that way?
Um, I teach at Pennsylvania Western University. I donated all my Unabomb papers there. You want to check out their website. And I just mentored a master's thesis from one of my former students. Literally today, she sent me the final copy of it. She submitted it today, and it was all about AI and language and forensic linguistics. So my student did a lot of research, and she actually educated me in some ways. But the bottom line is, it's still a wide open Wild West out there when it comes to AI, Chat GPT.
Mm.
I think we're a long ways away from AI taking over the world. We're being able to fool an experienced, knowledgeable forensic linguist.
Mm.
And there are just number of features that AI has just not quite resolved in terms of satire and parody and some noun phrases, some adjective phrases and verb phrases. They just haven't quite put together. There's some repetition. Greetings, salutations will look differently, punctuation. So I'm not saying it won't get there someday.
Mm.
I don't want this image in 10 years being played, on some website. Look what this guy Fitzgerald said back then.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
for right now, we're not there. I'm not concerned with it taking over the world. There's too many humans still involved in this. That's a whole different discussion, I know. But from a linguistic perspective, and when I give assignments to my students, they really can't use AI because they have to look at old cases that I've worked
Yeah,
or linguistic perspective, and there's just no narratives out there
yeah,
that would help them write these kind of papers. So I think AI still has a ways to go. It can be a convenient tool. It can be a worthwhile tool to some, but an experienced and knowledgeable and educated linguist will know how to see through it and know how to determine that it's not authentic. I guess it's human created, but at the same time, it's not human derived. It's not its author is not human, but of
yeah,
course it borrows from every algorithm out there, every database, every corpus, and in a way they start repeating each other sometimes, and that's where some of the signs are of that it's AI and it's not authentic language. But we have a long way to go, and it's not making our job. People would ask me for years, "Oh, Jim, what does autocorrect on in Word
yeah.
or auto spell, whatever the different versions are? Does that make your job more difficult?" And no, not really, because even autocorrect doesn't pick up on every misspelling, especially because North American English spells some words different than Irish English
Yeah.
spells some words, and just punctuation usage is differently utilized. So there's ways of getting around that, and I'll open this up
Yeah,
directly.
and Ray, just a question would say, and Jimmy, you can jump in after, but there's so much new information out there for anyone at all to see what the techniques are in terms of how cases are solved and maybe the steps that are taken between documentaries, between TV shows. Like, is it getting harder for people like yourselves to, solve a crime? Are the criminals, besides maybe an instance of passion or whatever it may be, but are criminals getting smarter in how they kind of cover up their tracks and making sure they don't get caught?
I don't think I would say they're getting smarter. I don't think they're doing anything or because of techniques are out there that they're coming up with new techniques. Maybe some things, but nothing that is going to hinder or prevent law enforcement from doing their job and doing it right. I think that there are individuals, there's so many different ways to commit different types of crimes. Most of the times, you look at the different types of scenes and offenders, and they're disorganized versus organized, and you really never find a completely organized individual. You may sometimes find someone that's completely organized, but it's a rarity.
Yeah.
Usually you'll find crimes or offenders that have mixed characteristics of both organization and disorganization. So
Right. Let me
the
just
only,
interrupt you. I
go ahead.
think both our biggest cases,
Yeah.
the 30-year bank robber and
Mhm.
Unabomb, were very organized.
Yes, I agree, Jim.
They were
I agree.
successful for long.
Well,
So they are.
and that's why they were that successful. You're right, Jim, because they were so organized in what they did. And when you look at the highly organized individual, you look at those individuals and they're extremely intelligent. You
Mm.
look at Ed Kemper, who was a serial killer, and he went on a rampage of 50 weeks of planned killing, where he
Wow.
probably could have continued to go on. He killed I think six young women, and I think eight total. And the last one was his mother. And
Jesus.
but he could have went on. I just think was he getting a little sloppy? And even my guy started getting a little sloppy at the end, where they become overconfident. And even Jimmy maybe can attest that he got maybe a little sloppy at the end, and maybe that's what helped us catch him. But the thing is that the people in law enforcement, we look at every single detail. We pay close attention to everything that's going on. So making it more difficult for us to solve the crime, I would have to say no, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I think with the advances in forensic science, it's actually helping
Yeah.
us in a lot of solving some of these cold cases, which I think is great. I think it's just fantastic.
That's unreal.
Dennis, wrapping things up here, just interesting. A
Yeah.
couple of nights ago on Cold Red, Ray and I interviewed two podcasters who have a podcast called Mind Over Murder, but they appeared on us with Cold Red. We'll drop that in the next week or two. One of these podcasters is actually the brother of a murder victim of a serial killer from back in the 1980s. And we don't go into the whole thing. People can listen to that particular episode, but he is very active in contacting police, FBI, and he's very vocal now with his own podcast. With two people have this podcast, and he's actually he's pushed the FBI to do some things maybe they wouldn't have done before. The FBI seems to be a little upset with him. So these amateur investigators, some of them are having an impact on investigations. Sometimes they can help, sometimes they can hurt. And it does get a little frustrating. Ray and I were both retired with 30 years, about 80 years between us, give or take. And it's one thing for us to comment about a case in our podcast. We're very careful, guarded, and we have all that
Yeah.
experience behind us. The amateurs out there are the ones that have to be careful, but they can do some internet searches that maybe law enforcement doesn't have a time to do, whatever, and they can come up with some interesting findings. But as long as they, provide it to law enforcement and don't just run out and publicly, put it out there. And if there is a bad guy and they're getting close to that person, they could actually alter their modus operandi, whatever. But I think the question you just asked, if people listen to our Cold Red episode, going to be dropped a little bit later in May of this year, it's 2024. You'll hear some interesting aspects of what it's like to be the brother of a murder victim and trying to deal with law enforcement and try to be helpful. All he wants is his sister's murder solved.
Yeah.
And there is a suspect, and you can listen to either their podcast or ours and get some more information on that. But it gets tricky out there, and I welcome the folks, the amateur. What's the one podcast? Don't F with cats. I don't know if we can use the F word on your podcast.
Walk away. You're grand. You're grand.
Don't fuck with cats. And I think it was a Canadian person that somehow someone put a picture up of a dead cat, and he said, "I killed it." And this team of amateur sleuths They spent about a year digging different aspects of the digital world, and they finally identified. I think some guy in Toronto was the one who actually did this, and he was involved in the murder of a human too. You're going to
Yeah.
kill. We learned that a long time ago in profiling, and
Yeah.
Ray knows this. You're going to torture or kill little animals, even if you're a kid. Your likelihood of hurting or killing adults when you reach that stage is very much increased, and that's something that we should all. If you have a little kid out there, what's the homicidal triad? Torture, killing animals, setting fires, and believe it or not, urinasis or bedwetting. The early days of studying profiling, they're the three most common denominators
Wow.
of future serial killers. Not everyone will be a serial killer, but if you are a serial killer, those are three of the factors that are certainly strong indicators that you may wind up morphing into that sort of violent lifestyle.
Wow. And look, I just want to kind of wrap up now because I'm really conscious of your time, and thanks so much for giving me your time. So firstly, where can people find your podcast? Where can people find information about the books that you've both written so far?
Jim?
Okay, yeah. The podcast is for both Ray and I co-hosts. We're just ending our third season now. coldredpodcast.com, and we're in all the regular Spotify and Apple places to find podcast. And we have a big European following and Australian as well as US, and we're getting bigger every year. My website is jamesrfitzgerald.com. My three books, fourth one coming out early next year, are all titled A Journey to the Center of the Mind. Books 1, books 2, and book 3. And it's my memoir from being a 5-year-old growing up in Philadelphia and solving my first case of my stolen bike to the Unabomb case in book 3, and a bunch of other stuff that'll be coming out in book 4, including working with Ray on some cases, the Center City rapist, and the murder of a police officer's daughter in suburban Philadelphia, and I'll be recounting those there too. So yeah, and Penn West University teach a course in forensic linguistics there. We have a 5.5-hour little program you can sign on to. Check that out. Get a real basic fundamental understanding of forensic linguistics. So that's pennwest.edu. So that's kind of a sum total of me online, and Ray has some similar information to provide.
Well, my website is raymondcarr.com. You can purchase my book off of the website. You can get it at Barnes & Noble. You can order it at Amazon, whatever you'd like to do. In reference to some of the other things I do, I'm a college professor at Wilmington University. I'm a senior director at a criminal justice institute that trains law enforcement. I just began putting together a program, a cold case program, that's going to look at cold cases, and it's going to use students in an internship to work side by side with police, cold case police detectives to help them in solving the crime. They're not going to do interviews, but they'll do searches for them. They'll organize, categorize, and digitize the cases to get them ready for prosecution. So that's a little bit about me. And please check us out on Cold Red.
Yeah, just to echo that, I started listening. Really, really good. Really, really enjoyed it. It's on my list now for when I have long drives and I can throw on an episode or two. So, thanks again, lads, for coming on. Really enjoyed it. I'll be honest with you, I have questions here. We only scratched the surface. I'll have to get you on again at some point.
Sure.
But thanks so much. And look, hope everything is well. Families are great, and we'll talk again soon.
We'll do it.
Thank you, Dennis. Great
Thank you,
coming on
Dennis.
here, and we will do it again sometime. Good question.
Absolutely.